The procession moved through Athens like a river of white linen and gold. At its centre walked 7-year-old Demetria, daughter of a prominent merchant family, her small hands clutching a ceremonial torch that seemed too heavy for her to carry. Behind her, the city's elite families whispered prayers and blessings. Ahead, the marble steps of the Parthenon rose toward the sky like a stairway to the gods themselves. She had been chosen, they told her, selected by sacred lottery to serve Athena for the next decade of her life. Her mother had wept with pride. Her father had commissioned new robes in celebration. But in the eyes of the older temple girls who waited at the summit, Demetria saw something that contradicted the joy around her, a warning her 7-year-old mind couldn't yet interpret, but her body would soon understand. The practice of dedicating young girls to temple service existed across the ancient world, from Greece to Mesopotamia, from Egypt to the Indus Valley. Public inscriptions praised it as the highest honour. Religious texts sanctified it as divine calling. For millennia, this was accepted as sacred tradition, noble families competing for the privilege of offering their daughters to the gods. But beneath the incense and ritual, beneath the poetry and prayers, operated a system that exploited childhood under the protection of religious authority. And history, written largely by those who benefited from that system, chose to look away. If you're drawn to the uncomfortable truths hidden beneath ancient religious practices and what really happened inside the temples we now visit as tourists, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us uncover more evidence buried in archaeological reports, rediscovered texts, and the fragments that survived precisely because no one thought they mattered. Now back to the story. The institution of temple service for girls took different forms across cultures, but the underlying patterns were remarkably consistent. In Athens, the archaeoroi were prepubescent girls chosen to serve Athena. In Rome, the Vestal virgins maintained the sacred flame. In Mesopotamia, the Naditu priestesses lived in temple complexes. In Egypt, young girls served as musicians and dancers in the temples of Hathor and Isis. Each culture claimed its version was unique, divinely ordained, fundamentally different from the others. Each culture was lying. Demetria entered the Parthenon through doors that would close behind her for the next 10 years. Inside, the temple complex was vast, not just a famous sanctuary with Phidias's colossal statue of Athena, but a labyrinth of auxiliary chambers, storage rooms, sleeping quarters, and spaces whose purposes weren't advertised to the public. She was taken to the quarters of the archaeoroi, where 4 other girls between ages 7 and 11 already lived under the supervision of priestesses, and, more significantly, under the authority of male priests who controlled the temple hierarchy. The older girls helped her settle in. They showed her where to sleep, where to wash, where the meals were served. They taught her the first rituals she would need to know: how to walk in processions, how to hold the sacred vessels, how to move through the temple, with the graceful silence that marked a proper servant of the goddess. But they didn't tell her everything. Some lessons, they said, could only be learned through experience. Their eyes carried the same warning she'd seen during the procession, amplified now by proximity and inevitability. The public duties of the archaeoroi were well documented. They participated in festivals, carried sacred objects in processions, wove the peplos that would adorn Athena's statue during the Panathenaic festival. These activities were photographed, so to speak, in pottery paintings, described in public inscriptions, praised in literary works. Aristophanes mentioned them. Pausanias catalogued their roles. Every educated Athenian knew about the archaeoroi, or rather, they knew what they were allowed to know. What happened in the private chambers, during the nights when public eyes couldn't see, remained hidden for millennia. There were hints, carefully worded references that later scholars either missed or chose not to pursue. A fragment from Euripides mentions the hidden service of temple girls. A vase painting shows a bearded priest alone with a young girl in a way that seems inconsistent with public ritual. An administrative text from the temple allocates funds for the private instruction of the chosen ones. Each hint was dismissible on its own. Together they formed a pattern. Modern archaeological work has provided harder evidence. Excavations beneath the Acropolis in the 1980s uncovered chambers that weren't part of the public temple structure. Small rooms with narrow sleeping platforms, windowless spaces designed for isolation. In one chamber, archaeologists found graffiti scratched into the plaster by a child's hand. Names, dates, marks that tracked time in a way that suggested someone was counting days until release. The excavation report, published in an obscure Greek archaeological journal in 1987, noted these findings, but offered no interpretation. The evidence sat in the literature for decades, unexamined and unconsidered. Demetria learned the public rituals quickly. She was a smart child, obedient and eager to please. But 3 months into her service, she was summoned for what the head priestess called the deeper mysteries. Instruction that would be provided privately by the high priest, Heracles, a man in his 50s who had served the temple for over 30 years. She was told to go to one of the inner chambers after the evening meal, alone, and wait for instruction. The chamber was small, lit by a single oil lamp. Heracles arrived and closed the door behind him. He spoke kindly at first, explaining that she was about to learn secrets that could only be shared with those chosen by the goddess. Special knowledge required special teaching. He asked if she understood the honour being given to her. She nodded because at 7 years old, she had been trained to obey authority, especially religious authority that spoke with the voice of the gods. What happened next was framed as ritual, as sacred instruction, as necessary initiation into divine service. Heracles called it learning the mysteries of the goddess. He said it was ancient tradition that every archaeoroi before her had received the same teaching, that it would make her closer to Athena. The religious language transformed abuse into sacrament, exploitation into enlightenment. And because it was presented as sacred, because it was conducted by a priest in a temple, because it was wrapped in the language of divine mystery, it went unchallenged. This pattern appears across ancient temple systems with such consistency that it cannot be coincidental. In Rome, the Vestal virgins were supposedly protected by the most severe penalties. Any sexual violation of a Vestal was punishable by death for the perpetrator and live burial for the Vestal herself. Yet the historical record includes multiple cases of pregnant Vestals, always attributed to the girl's moral failing rather than to the men who had access to their secluded quarters. The scandal of 114 BCE involved 3 Vestals accused of breaking their vows. All 3 were buried alive. The men involved faced no consequences because officially no men were involved. The logical impossibility was never questioned. How did cloistered virgins living under strict supervision in the house of the Vestals become pregnant? The official answer: moral weakness, secret lovers. Feminine corruption required believing that these girls somehow smuggled men into one of Rome's most heavily guarded sacred sites, repeatedly, without anyone noticing. The alternative explanation, that the men with legitimate access to their quarters were responsible, was too dangerous to voice. A letter from Cicero discussing one of these scandals comes tantalizingly close to acknowledging the truth. Who truly knows what happens behind the sacred walls, where only the consecrated may enter? The question was rhetorical, meant to emphasize mystery. But it also contained an admission. The very secrecy that was supposed to protect these girls also protected their abusers. In Mesopotamia, the Naditu priestesses lived in the Gagum, walled temple complexes in cities like Sippar and Nippur. These women, girls really, as many entered service between ages 6 and 12, were consecrated to the god Shamash and forbidden from marrying or bearing children. Thousands of cuneiform tablets document their economic activities, their property transactions, their business acumen. They appear in the records as sophisticated economic actors managing significant wealth, yet other tablets hint at a darker reality. A legal text from the Old Babylonian period, c. 1800 BCE, addresses what happens if a Naditu senplaumti arkisi kontam becomes pregnant. The punishment is severe, death by burning. But like the Roman Vestal scandals, the text never explains how a woman living in a cloistered religious community, forbidden from contact with men, could become pregnant. The law assumes the possibility while maintaining the fiction of their isolation. Other documents are more explicit. A letter discovered at Mari, dated to approximately 1780 BCE, mentions concerns about improper conduct by temple administrators toward the consecrated girls. The writer urges discretion, noting that such matters, if made public, would bring shame upon the temple and the god. The letter makes clear that the conduct was known, was ongoing, and was being deliberately concealed to protect the institution's reputation. Demetria's instruction continued throughout her service. Heracles summoned her regularly, always in private chambers, always under the guise of spiritual teaching. The other girls knew, of course. The older ones had experienced the same instruction. They formed a silent community of shared trauma, never speaking openly about what happened, but finding ways to support each other through glances, small kindnesses, and the solidarity of mutual survival. One girl, Philomena, aged 10, tried to resist. When summoned by Heracles, she refused to go. The priestesses told her she was defying the goddess. They reminded her that her family had dedicated her to sacred service, that she was bound by vows, that disobedience would bring divine punishment not just to her but to her entire family. When she still refused, she was locked in one of the windowless chambers for 3 days without food. When she emerged, she went where she was told. This enforcement mechanism appeared in every temple system. The girls weren't just physically confined, they were spiritually imprisoned by the belief that their suffering served divine purposes. Resistance meant not just defying a priest, but defying the gods themselves. The religious framework transformed the victim's natural impulse to escape into a sin worse than the abuse she was trying to avoid. In Egypt, young girls served as temple musicians and dancers, participating in festivals and daily rituals. Tomb paintings show them playing sistrums and lyres, dancing before statues of the gods, their movements frozen in eternal celebration. These images decorated the walls of elite tombs, proof of piety and cultural refinement. But other evidence tells a more complicated story. Papyrus fragments from the New Kingdom period include medical texts describing treatments for young girls suffering from genital trauma. The texts are clinical, listing symptoms and remedies without explaining causes. But the demographic specificity is striking. These treatments appear in sections dealing with temple personnel, alongside remedies for priests' various ailments. The medical texts document the consequences while maintaining silence about the causes. A more direct piece of evidence emerged in 2011, when archaeologists excavating a temple complex at Abydos discovered a cache of ostraca, pottery shards used for informal writing. Among the mundane notes about supplies and schedules were several messages between young temple servants. One, written in a child's uncertain hand, reads, "Tell mother the priest comes at night. I'm afraid, but they say this is service to the goddess. When can I come home?" The message was never sent. It was found among broken pottery in a trash pit, discarded and forgotten for 3,000 years. The excavation team published it in their full report, but the fragment received almost no attention in popular archaeology. It was too uncomfortable, too explicit, too challenging to the romantic narratives about ancient Egyptian spirituality. Demetria completed her 10 years of service in 421 BCE. She was 17, no longer the hopeful child who had climbed the temple steps a decade earlier. The city celebrated her release with the same ceremony that had marked her arrival. Her family welcomed her home with feasts and gifts. Marriage prospects were discussed. Her service as an archaephoroi made her a prestigious match. Everyone praised her dedication, her piety, her years of service to the goddess. No one asked what those years had actually contained. No one wanted to know. The system depended on collective willful ignorance, on maintaining the fiction that temple service was pure spiritual elevation, rather than a decade of systematic exploitation. The girls who emerged from that service had learned one lesson above all others. Silence was survival. Some girls never emerged. The mortality rate for temple servants was significantly higher than for their peers in the general population. Malnutrition, disease, and what the records delicately termed melancholy killed girls throughout their service. A statistical analysis of temple records from multiple sites, published in a 2003 academic study, found that girls in temple service had a 40% higher mortality rate than girls of comparable age and social class outside the temples. The study noted this discrepancy, but struggled to explain it. Poor medical care, inadequate nutrition. The study avoided the obvious conclusion that the conditions of temple service itself, the physical abuse, the the psychological trauma. The total lack of agency might contribute to elevated mortality. Academic language has its own ways of maintaining silence. In some cases, girls chose death over continued service. A fragment from the Greek historian Timaeus mentions a temple girl in Syracuse who threw herself from the temple roof rather than continue her service. The incident was recorded as divine madness, possession by malevolent spirits. The possibility that her action was rational, a desperate escape from intolerable conditions, was never considered. The temple systems were economically sophisticated, and the girls were part of that economy. In Mesopotamia, the Naditu Monihore, priestesses controlled significant wealth, but that wealth was managed by male temple administrators who had total access to the girls themselves. The economic records show temple officials drawing funds for the maintenance of the consecrated girls, but archaeological evidence of their living conditions suggests they lived in relative poverty, while the administrators lived in luxury. A particularly revealing set of tablets from Sippar, dating to approximately 1750 BCE, records a complaint by a Naditu named Iltani about her living conditions. She petitioned the temple administration for better food, warmer clothes, repairs to her chamber. The petition was denied. 6 months later, the records show her chamber and her property reassigned to a new Naditu. There is no record of what happened to Iltani. She simply disappeared from the documentary record, her name appearing one final time in a property transfer, her voice silenced mid-complaint. The system perpetuated itself through careful selection and social pressure. Families competed to have their daughters chosen for temple service. It was a mark of status, a religious honour, sometimes a political necessity. In Athens, serving as an archaeoroi could cement a family's position in the aristocracy. In Rome, having a daughter become a Vestal Virgin brought the entire family prestige and legal privileges. The benefits to the family outweighed any concerns about what their daughters might experience, and the girls themselves internalised the system's logic. When Demetria married at 18, she had daughters of her own. When the eldest reached age 7, Demetria enrolled her in the lottery for selection as an archaeoroi. She knew exactly what that service entailed. She had lived it. But the social pressure, the religious imperative, the economic advantages, all of it overwhelmed her maternal instinct to protect. When her daughter was chosen, Demetria wept with pride, just as her own mother had. The cycle continued. This perpetuation across generations was the system's greatest success. The victims became complicit, not because they were evil, but because they had been so thoroughly broken and reshaped by their experience that they couldn't imagine an alternative. The abuse was normalised, sanctified, transformed into something their culture defined as beautiful and holy. The historical whitewashing began almost immediately. By the Roman period, Greek writers were already romanticising the archaeoroi as innocent maidens serving the goddess in pure devotion. Pausanias' description of Athenian religious practices, written in the 2nd century CE, 600 years after Demetria's time, presents temple service as unambiguously virtuous. He knew the traditions had access to older records, but chose to present only the sanitized version. This selective memory continued through the Renaissance, when European scholars rediscovered classical texts and fell in love with an idealized vision of ancient Greece and Rome. The Vestal Virgins became symbols of pristine dedication. Temple servants became romantic figures of spiritual purity. The uncomfortable evidence was ignored or reinterpreted to fit the idealized narrative. Even modern archaeology has been slow to confront the evidence. When researchers discover the private chambers, the medical texts, the fragmentary letters, the demographic anomalies, there's often a reluctance to draw obvious conclusions. Academic language provides cover, possible irregularities, potential misconduct, alleged incidents. The passive voice does heavy lifting. Girls were subjected to, rather than priests subjected girls to. The system of abuse becomes abstracted into a force without perpetrators, trauma without responsibility. A groundbreaking 2015 study analysed skeletal remains from temple servant burials across the Mediterranean. The researchers found evidence of chronic stress, malnutrition, and physical trauma inconsistent with the official narrative of honoured service. Bone development suggested prolonged anxiety. Stress markers on teeth indicated periods of severe psychological distress during childhood. Several skeletons showed evidence of sexual trauma. The study was published in a specialised bioarchaeology journal with limited circulation. It received almost no popular press coverage. The few news articles that mentioned it focused on the harsh conditions of ancient religious life, without addressing what those harsh conditions actually entailed. Once again, academic passive voice obscured agency and responsibility. The practice wasn't limited to the classical Mediterranean. In India, the Devadasi system dedicated young girls to temple service, a practice that continued into the 20th century before being officially banned. The girls were married to the deity, rendering them unable to marry mortal men, and were expected to serve the temple and its priests. British colonial records from the 1800s documented what that service included, describing it as religious prostitution and temple slavery. Indian reformers in the early 20th century campaigned against the system, producing documentation of abuse that had continued for potentially thousands of years. One reformer, Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy, collected testimony from former Devadasi women describing their experiences. The accounts were harrowing. Girls as young as 6 dedicated to temples, sexually exploited by priests and wealthy patrons, trapped in the system by religious authority and social stigma. Her work led to the Madras Devadasi Act of 1947, which officially abolished the practice. But the law's passage required admitting that temple service had been exploitative, that religious authority had been abused, that what was presented as sacred tradition was actually systematic child abuse. That admission came with tremendous resistance. Defenders of the tradition argued it was being misunderstood by Western morality, that the Devadasi served important cultural functions, that banning it was cultural imperialism. The same arguments that had protected the practice for millennia were deployed one final time. Similar patterns appeared in pre-Columbian America. Inca and Aztec temple complexes housed akala, or chosen women, young girls selected for temple service. Spanish conquistador accounts describe these systems, though their testimony is complicated by their own biases and their need to justify conquest by portraying indigenous religions as corrupt. Still, the consistency of their descriptions, young girls in temple service, under the authority of male priests, with restricted freedom and undisclosed duties, matches the patterns seen elsewhere. What makes the evidence compelling isn't any single source, but the global pattern. Across continents, across cultures that had no contact with each other, across thousands of years, the same system appeared. Young girls dedicated to temples, praised publicly, exploited privately, silenced systematically. The universality suggests something deeper than coincidence. It reveals how religious authority, combined with patriarchal power structures and the vulnerability of children, creates conditions where abuse becomes institutionalized, normalized, and protected. Demetria died in 387 BCE at age 46. Her grave marker, discovered in the 19th century, identifies her as Demetria, daughter of Cleon, who served Athena with honour. The inscription mentions her service as an arephorai I, prominently, as if those years were her defining achievement. There is no mention of her husband, her children, or anything she accomplished in the 3 decades after leaving the temple. In death as in life, she was reduced to her temple service, the very thing that had stolen her childhood, presented as her greatest glory. Her skeleton was examined during a 1990 study of ancient Athenian health. The researchers noted evidence of chronic stress, bone abnormalities consistent with malnutrition during her growth years, and markers suggesting significant psychological trauma during childhood. The report concluded that despite her privileged background, this individual experienced significant hardship during her youth. Cause unknown. The cause was in the inscription on her grave marker, but the researchers didn't make the connection. The fragmentary evidence we have, the archaeological finds, the medical texts, the legal documents addressing pregnancy in supposedly celibate temple servants, the suspicious mortality rates, the graffiti counting days, the letter never sent home. All of it points to the same conclusion. But history has been reluctant to reach that conclusion. preferring comfortable myths about ancient piety over uncomfortable truths about ancient abuse. The reluctance is understandable. Acknowledging the systematic exploitation of temple girls requires confronting the possibility that religious authority has always been vulnerable to abuse, that sacred spaces don't guarantee sacred behaviour, that what civilizations define as holy can be deeply corrupt. It's easier to admire the Parthenon's marble columns than to think about what happened in the chambers beneath them. It's more comfortable to romanticize Vestal virgins than to ask how cloistered girls became pregnant. It's simpler to praise ancient devotion than to acknowledge ancient trauma. But the evidence exists, scattered across archaeological reports and obscure academic journals, waiting in museum collections and untranslated texts. The girls themselves left marks, scratches on walls, letters in trash pits, stress markers on bones, demographic anomalies in death records. They couldn't speak openly, but they found ways to testify. History has an obligation to finally listen. If you've heard this story tonight, understand that it's assembled from fragments that scholars have known about for decades, but have rarely discussed publicly. The evidence has been there all along. We've just been collectively choosing not to see it. These weren't isolated incidents or cultural misunderstandings. This was systematic, protected by religious authority, justified by sacred tradition, and maintained through centuries of deliberate silence. Leave a comment. Tell us what you felt reading about what they endured, and if you want more stories that ancient civilizations buried beneath their temples, and modern scholarship has been slow to excavate, subscribe and step deeper into the shadows with us. Because some truths have been hidden for thousands of years, and it's long past time we brought them into the light.